Hey, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of history's darkest and somehow most transformative chapters, the Black Death. We're gonna unpack the Black Death and how people even managed to survive this brutal pandemic. But before you get too comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually dig what I'm doing here, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, turn off the lights, crank up the fan for some white noise, and let's enjoy tonight's little journey together. Congrats! You just woke up in Europe, year 1347. The morning air is crisp as you open. Your eyes stretched out on a straw mattress. You're not in your own bedroom like usual. You're in a one-room wooden house with the rest of your family. The walls are made of wattle and daub, basically. A wooden frame stuffed with mud, clay, and straw. Surprisingly decent at keeping the cold out. Though, the thatched roof leaks when it rains hard. As you wake, your nose is hit with some familiar smells. Smoke from last night's fire, the earthy scent of dirt underfoot, and, well, that distinct medieval haven't showered in weeks aroma. Bathing wasn't really a thing back then. The good news? No one cared because everyone smelled pretty much the same. Your stomach grumbles from hunger. If you're lucky, there's still some leftover bread from yesterday, though it's probably rock hard by now. You can soften it up with some beer. Yep, even kids drank weak beer back then. It was usually safer than water, which could easily make you seriously ill. If it came from a contaminated source, outside your little house, the village is starting to buzz. You hear cows mooing from afar, roosters crowing, neighbors calling out as they begin their day. Most folks here are peasants or working the land either as free tenants, paying rent to the local lord, or as serfs stuck to the soil. Forced to provide labor, life's got a predictable rhythm. In your medieval village, days are measured by sunrise and sunset, weeks marked by church bells calling you to mass, and years tracked by the changing seasons and farming cycles. Sure, it's a tough life, but it's the only one you've ever known. What you don't know, what no one in Europe knows yet, is that everything's about to change. A shadow is spreading across the continent, a shadow that will transform society in ways no war or famine ever could. The first whispers reach your village through a traveling merchant. He brings exotic goods from faraway lands, silk from the east, spices from distant realms. But this time, he's carrying something else. Stories, terrifying stories about a disease devastating cities along the trade routes. He says thousands are dying from a mysterious illness, causing fever, painful swellings, and near certain death. Some villagers cross themselves and mumble prayers. Others think these tales are just exaggerations. After all, scary rumors tend to spread faster than the truth. The merchant moves on, and life goes on as usual for a while, but the rumors keep coming, more often and more frightening by the month. By fall, whispers turn into alarm bells. The disease has reached Europe's Mediterranean ports, Milan, Marseille, Venice. They say ships arrive, carrying nothing but corpses. Sailors died en route. Dear God, please save us, your mother murmurs upon hearing the news. Crossing herself, in your village, people start, preparing as best they can, even if no one really knows what they're preparing for. Some stockpile extra food, others spend more. Time in church, begging for divine protection. The local healer gathers herbs and potions, though some folks thought these stories were just blown way out of proportion. After all, scary rumors tend to spread faster than the actual truth, right? The merchant kept on with his travels, and life went on as usual for a while. But those rumors, oh, they kept coming more often and way creepier by the month. By fall, the whispers had turned into full-on alarm bells ringing. This plague had hit the Mediterranean ports, Milan, Marseille, Venice. They said ships were docking with nothing but dead bodies aboard. Sailors had died during their voyages. Dear God, please save us, your mom muttered, crossing herself when she got the news. In your village, folks started preparing as best they could, even though nobody really knew what they were prepping for. Some hoarded extra food, others spent more time praying in church for divine protection. The local healer gathered herbs and potions, though no one had a clue if they'd actually work on this mysterious sickness. The first cases showed up in your area during the freezing winter months. A nearby village, just half a day's walk away, reported sudden deaths. Victims had high fevers, terrible thirst, and weird black lumps popping up under their arms and groin. Almost nobody survived past 3 days. After symptoms appeared, your village elders gathered to figure out what to do. Some suggested shutting down the whole village. After spotting these symptoms, the village elders held a meeting to figure out what to do. Some wanted to lock down the whole village, no outsiders allowed. Others thought, nah, trade and chit-chat gotta go on. So life went on, but with a fresh new wave of terror lurking in the air. Then, one chilly morning, a young guy working at the factory just didn't show up. When someone checked on him, they found him burning up with fever, drenched in sweat, and a swollen neck lump the size of a hen's head. Yep, the plague had crashed your village's party. What followed was a nightmare you couldn't even imagine. The disease spread at a terrifying speed. One day, you're healthy. The next, you're burning up. And by day 3, well, you're usually dead. Those black lumps, that's why they called it the Black Death. And it was as painful as it sounds. Some victims coughed up blood, signaling the plague had hit their lungs. Those poor souls rarely lasted more than a day or two. Some folks said it was God's punishment, a chance to self-flagellate and repent their sins. Others blamed foul air, carrying bouquets around to ward off the stinky poison they thought caused the disease. A few whispered in the shadows that Jews were poisoning the wells, even though your village had no Jews living there. And those accusations made 0 sense. The truth no one in the 14th century could grasp. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. This tiny bug hitchhiked inside fleas, which then clung onto rats. Those stowaway rats on ships and in medieval towns were unwitting carriers of death across continents. When an infected flea bit a person, it vomited bacteria into the wound. Charming, right? The bacteria multiplied fast, usually causing those painful swollen lymph nodes. If it reached the lungs, it triggered pneumonic plague, which could spread directly person to person through coughs and breaths. But you didn't know any of this. All you saw was people dropping like flies, and nobody seemed able to stop it. Your village, just like thousands of others across Europe, was being devoured by the plague. The church bells, once ringing to mark time and call prayers, now tolled endlessly for the dead. Eventually, there were so many deaths that the bells fell silent. Bodies were buried fast, with no time for fancy funerals. The elaborate rituals marking someone's journey to the afterlife gone. Now corpses were tossed onto carts and dumped in mass graves. Some families lost so many that no one was left to bury the dead, and bodies could rot inside houses for days until neighbors or parish officials hauled them away. Fear twisted how people treated each other. Those with healthy relatives shut their doors tight against visitors, while families with the sick got shunned. Some fled to the countryside, hoping distance would keep the plague at bay. Others turned to religion with newfound fervor, marching the streets, whipping themselves to calm the god's wrath. Priests, who should have been the comforters, were dropping dead in alarming numbers. Their job required them to give last rites to the dying, putting them face to face with the plague non-stop. Many ran away, abandoning their flocks when they needed them most. Those who stayed often ended up sick themselves. Your family's been lucky so far. Even with the plague raging around you, no one in your household is sick. You've heard stories of entire families wiped out in nearby villages, orphans dying within days, lovers torn apart by death just hours after pledging forever. But luck doesn't last forever. In a world where the Black Death wiped out 1/3 to half the population. One morning, your little brother complains he's feeling off. By noon, he's burning up with fever. By night, there's a swollen lump on his neck, and you know exactly what that means. A sip of water or weak beer. Your dad talks about taking him to a monastery, where monks supposedly heal the sick, but everyone knows those places are bursting at the seams with plague victims. For 3 days, your brother's condition gets worse. That swelling just keeps growing, turning bright red, then black. His breathing gets ragged, and he screams in pain and delirium. You take turns sitting by him, even though your fear screams at you to stay back. Then on day 4, surprise. While most plague victims hit their death spiral, your brother's fever breaks. He's weak as a wet noodle, but still conscious. The swelling's still there, but calmed down a bit. Over the next few days, it bursts and drains pus. Gross. But hey, hopeful. Against all odds, your brother becomes one of the few survivors of the Black Death. What you couldn't know then is why he made it, when so many others didn't. Modern science later finds some folks carry a gene mutation called Delta 32 that protects against the plague bacteria. This mutation messes with a protein named CCR5 on white blood cells, making it harder for the bacteria to sneak in and hijack the immune system. Your brother might have had this mutation, along with some other family members, this genetic fluke, a random accident of nature. gave some families a fighting chance against the deadliest pandemic in human history. And weirdly enough, centuries later, scientists discover the same mutation also offers protection against another killer, HIV, the virus behind AIDS. So, the Black Death. By choosing survivors with this gene, unknowingly shielded some of their descendants from a disease that wouldn't even exist for another 600 years. But that's a tale for another time. Right now, your family is throwing a party for your brother's miraculous recovery. Not everyone's so lucky. Weeks pass, and the plague keeps killing folks in your village. From around 200 souls, less than 100 remain. Fields lie fallow, those who worked them are dead, or too busy nursing the sick, or digging graves. The lord of the manor, holed up in a stone house on the hill overlooking the village, has lost his wife and 2 kids. Even wealth and privilege can't outrun the Black Death. Strangely, some people seem immune despite constant exposure. The village gravedigger, a nasty character who loots the dead before burial and handles plague corpses daily, never shows a single symptom. A midwife who cares for the sick when not delivering babies stays healthy, despite the obvious risks of her job. Like your brother, they might carry the protective gene, but medieval folks chalked up their survival to divine intervention or shady deals with dark forces. Food becomes scarce as crops are neglected, and trade slows to a crawl. Prices for essentials skyrocket, and anything deemed a cure weirds, herbs, strange treatments, religious relics becomes expensive, if you can even find it. When winter hits and the plague draws near, the disease starts to weaken, not because of human effort, but because of nature's rhythm. Fleas get less active in the cold, and rats tend to huddle in their nests. For a brief moment, people hope the worst is over, but the Black Death isn't finished. It just retreats, waiting to strike again with spring's warm weather, hunting for fresh victims among those who survived the first wave. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive plague outbreaks sweep across Europe, killing roughly 75 to 200 million people, maybe half the continent's population. The world that survives this nightmare changes forever. The massive population drop shatters feudalism, boosts labor's worth, and shifts power between peasants and nobles. Religious authority is questioned as people wonder why their prayers went unanswered, and so many priests ditched their duties. Europe's population, the world that survived this disaster, would be fundamentally changed. The massive population drop would break the feudal system, hike up the value of labor, and shift power dynamics between peasants and nobles. Religious authority would be questioned as people wondered why their prayers went unanswered and why so many priests abandoned their duties. Medical knowledge, mostly based on ancient texts and superstition, would be challenged by the failure of traditional treatments against this plague. For survivors like your brother, the gravedigger, or the midwife, life would never be the same again. They were the lucky ones. Even though they carried the heavy burden of survival in a world full of loss, they'd rebuild society, renegotiate the relationship with the authorities, and slowly piece together a post-plague world that, for better or worse. We'll shove Europe onto the path of modernity. But hey, that's tomorrow night's story. For now, as you drift off, picture yourself as one of those medieval survivors, gazing at the first stars blinking to life above your village. The plague is over, at least for now. You've lived through humanity's darkest hour, and even though you don't quite realize it yet, you're standing at the doorstep of a new world, born from the ashes of the old one. Your soft breathing blends with the nighttime sounds outside, distant dogs barking, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Against all odds, despite unimaginable loss and pain, life goes on, and in that simple truth lies maybe the Black Death's most important lesson: humanity's stubborn grit, its ability to endure, adapt, and eventually carry on. The morning after your brother's miraculous recovery hits you with a weird mix of feelings. Sure, you feel relieved, but there's also this strange, unfamiliar twinge, that survivor's guilt, the feeling of being worthless, amid widespread suffering that haunts many who make it through disasters. Your brother is weak but alert. For the first time in days, his eyes shine again. The wound on his neck left an ugly scar that'll stay with him for life, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But hey, a scar beats a grave any day, and your family treats each day of his recovery like a real gift. "Why am I alive when so many others died?" he asks one evening, his voice still rough from illness. Your mom, lighting a candle as night falls, pauses before answering. "God's will," she says simply, though you can tell she's not totally convinced. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could grasp, is way more complicated throughout human history. Infectious diseases have acted like ruthless agents of natural selection. People with genetic advantages fighting specific germs had a better shot at surviving, passing those protective traits to future generations. The Black Death might be the textbook example of this in human history. Deep inside your brother's cells, and probably yours too, lies a gene mutation that alters a protein called CCR5 on white blood cells' surfaces. This mutation, known as Delta 32, creates a shortened version of the protein, making it harder for plague bacteria to sneak in and hijack immune cells. Some people have one copy of this mutation, giving partial protection. A lucky few have two copies, granting them serious resistance. It's genetic lottery, and your brother just happened to hold a winning ticket. But the price for this evolutionary edge was paid in millions of lives. Those without the protective mutation died from the Black Death when your brother finally gets back on his feet and steps outside for the first time since falling ill. You notice how drastically the village has changed. The once tended gardens have gone wild. Empty houses stand where owners died or fled. The usual daily rhythms, blacksmith's hammer, weaving loom, grinding wheel, have fallen silent or vanished completely. Yet amid this ruin, signs of resilience emerge. A market is held, smaller than before but buzzing with the energy of survivors determined to keep living. Farmers from faraway places bring their harvests. A traveling merchant, braver or crazier than most, carries salt, spices, and news from distant lands. The news everywhere is the same destruction followed by cautious recovery. No place, completely vanished. Yet, amid this destruction, signs of resilience appeared. A market was held smaller than before, but buzzing with the energy of survivors determined to keep going. Farmers from distant regions brought their harvests. A traveling merchant, braver or maybe just more reckless than most, brought salt, spices, and news from faraway places. The story was the same everywhere: destruction, followed by cautious recovery. No place escaped, though some suffered worse than others. Crowded cities with poor sanitation took the hardest hit. Some small, isolated mountain or forest villages fared better, though almost no one escaped entirely. In your area, maybe half the population died. In some places, the toll was even higher. The merchant told tales of ghost towns with no living souls left, of monasteries wiped out completely, and noble families wiped off the map, their massive estates suddenly airless. But he also told tales of places where life went on, surprisingly normal, communities banding together to care for orphans and widows, random acts of kindness popping up when you least expected it. One story in particular caught your attention. In a village much like yours, a woman named Elizabeth lost her husband and 6 kids to the plague, all within 1 week. She dragged their bodies up the hill behind her house and buried each one herself. Somehow, despite being up close and personal with the disease, Elizabeth never got sick. Like your brother and the village gravedigger, she seemed to have some sort of natural immunity. That very genetic protection is what modern science might one day discover. The merchant lowered his voice, even though no one was nearby to eavesdrop. How could she touch the dead and stay alive? Some folks wanted to dunk her in a pond, but most were just grateful someone was willing to bury their dead. Rumors like these ran wild in desperate times. Survivors, especially lone women or those with odd habits or looks, were often suspected of shady dealings. Fear and superstition grew alongside the plague, sometimes turning victims into villains. Your father, who had listened to these merchants' stories, shook his head. "Survival's not magic," he said firmly. "Some folks are just tougher than illness, like my son." Proudly, he rested a hand on your brother's shoulder. The merchant nodded in agreement, always careful not to offend a potential client. "That's right. Every village has those people the plague just can't touch. Maybe they're chosen by God." When winter came, bringing bitter cold and early darkness, your village started a new chapter. Fewer mouths to feed meant the food stores lasted longer than usual. A tiny stroke of luck, but also fewer hands to chop wood, fix houses, tend animals, and do the hundreds of daily chores needed to survive medieval life. This labor shortage caused subtle but significant shifts in the relationship between peasants and nobles. Your father, a skilled carpenter, suddenly found himself in demand. The lord of the manor, who used to just bark orders, now had to negotiate better terms for urgent repairs. He offered me a penny per night. Your dad told your mom in a low, amazed voice. 3 days' work and some bacon on the side. A wage unimaginable before the plague hit. But with half the craftsmen dead, survivors' skills were more valued than ever. Similar changes spread through every social class. Farm labor, once plentiful and easily replaced, now came with higher pay. Housemaids, especially those experienced in running large households, found themselves sought after by noble families devastated by the plague. Women also found new opportunities in this changing world. Widows who once remarried quickly now often chose to stay independent, running businesses left by their late husbands. Guild restrictions that once barred women from certain trades were unofficially loosened due to urgent demand. A woman in the neighboring village took over her husband's forge, angering traditionalists, but providing an essential service no one else could. For serfs, legally tied too, their skills were valued more than ever. Similar changes spread through all social classes. Farm labor, once abundant and easily replaced, now got paid better for their work. Domestic servants, especially those experienced in managing large houses, found themselves in high demand by noble families. Many servants having been wiped out by the plague, women also found new opportunities in this changing world. Widows who used to remarry quickly now often chose to stay independent, running the businesses left by their late husbands. Guild restrictions that once blocked women from certain trades were unofficially relaxed due to urgent need. A woman in a neighboring village took over her husband's blacksmith shop, enraging traditionalists, but providing an essential service no one else could. For peasants, legally tied to traditionalism, but somehow it still offered an essential service no one else could provide. For the serfs, legally tied to the land they worked, the plague sparked an unprecedented migration. Many desperate lords, eager to keep their fields productive, granted freedom to serfs willing to stay and work. Others realized they could just pack up and leave for towns or places with better conditions, with too many dead to force people back. Enforcing those old rules got way harder. Not all these changes happened overnight, of course. The shift was gradual, and with the plague's death toll, cracking down became near impossible. Restrictions like that, good luck with that now. The feudal system that shaped European society for centuries didn't collapse in a single night. But the seeds of change were planted in those early post-plague years, and they'd bloom in the decades ahead. As for your family, you're doing your best to adjust to this new reality. Your brother's back on his feet, though he gets tired easier than before. Your dad's woodworking skills are suddenly in high demand, bringing home more cash than ever. Your mom's doing laundry for the nobles, finally getting paid what she deserves since there aren't enough hands around. You yourself find chances that never existed before. The parish priest, one of the few clergy who didn't die or run off during the worst plague days, needs someone to help keep church records. With basic reading and writing skills, pretty rare for a peasant kid. Thanks to your mom who once served a noble family, you fit the job, spring rolls in, bringing both hope and dread. Warm weather breathes new life. Crops sprout. In the fields, wildflowers pepper the meadows. Birds return from their winter travels. But it also sets the stage for the plague to come back. Sure enough, by early summer, new cases start popping up. This second wave is less brutal than the first. Fewer get infected, and many survivors carry some disease-resistant genes. Still, every new death reopens wounds the community hasn't healed yet. One afternoon, while helping the priest update the parish death registry, a painfully long document, you ask a question that's caused a lot of headaches before. Father, why did God send this plague down on us, the priest? An old man with a face creased from exhaustion thinks for a moment before answering. Some say it's punishment for sin. He finally says, others believe it's a test of faith. The Pope himself has called for prayers and repentance to end this disaster. He dips his quill in ink, adding another name to the register. But I've seen the most devout die in agony, while notorious sinners live on unharmed. I've prayed at the bedsides of innocent children, taken by the plague. He sighs deeply. Maybe God's plan is beyond our understanding. This crisis of faith was repeating itself in communities all over Europe. The plague challenged medieval religious beliefs. If it's divine punishment, why strike both the righteous and the wicked if prayer and repentance are cures? Why did the most pious monasteries suffer the highest death rates? The Church's power, once nearly absolute in earthly misfortune, began showing cracks that would widen over centuries. Medical knowledge faced similar challenges. University-trained doctors weren't any better than village healers at treating the plague. Their complicated theories about bodily humors and celestial alignments couldn't explain why some survived while others died, why some communities got hit harder than others. Some brave doctors cared for the sick, sometimes losing their own lives. Others ran away at the first sign of illness, putting self-preservation over duty. Those who stayed wore bizarre protective gear, long wax-coated robes, gloves, and bird-beak masks stuffed with herbs and spices, believed to purify the air. This weird outfit, later iconic in plague outbreaks, didn't actually protect them from the real source of infection. With no effective official treatment, communities had to come up with their own responses to the disease. Some leaned on superstition, carrying amulets, chanting spells, avoiding black cats or the real source of infection. With no official cure in sight, communities had to come up with their own responses to the plague. Some leaned on superstition, carrying amulets, chanting spells, avoiding black cats or redheads. Others actually had some practical value, like isolating the sick, burning the plague victims' belongings, keeping things clean. None of it was foolproof. But these grassroots measures sometimes helped slow the spread. Your village probably tried some of this stuff. Houses hit by plague got marked with white crosses on the doors. Outsiders had to hang out in a designated hut for 3 days before entering. The dead get buried fast, with just a simple ceremony. Their belongings get burned to a crisp. These precautions work, kinda, but they can't stop the plague entirely. By midsummer, your village has lost dozens more to the second wave. A heavy blow to a community already knocked down by the first outbreak. One victim is Lord Mana, a man in his 50s who survived the first wave but couldn't dodge the second. His death shakes the whole local social hierarchy to its core. His son, just 20 and fresh, back from university in Paris, inherits the estate and lands. This new lord, young and influenced by fresh ideas from his schooling, manages the estate way differently than his dad did. Seeing the labor shortage and power shifts, he offers better terms to the peasants. Those who agree to stay and work for the ship owners get freedom plus cheaper rent deals. Skilled workers, including your dad, score privileges usually reserved for the upper class. Not all nobles roll with the changes so easily. Some lords try to double down on old restrictions, harshly banning peasants from leaving, punishing wage demands, and using force to keep the old order. Spoiler alert, it rarely works long term. Peasants just up and leave, chasing better opportunities elsewhere. With plenty of land and labor scarce, they're not short on options. The second wave finally backs off as autumn rolls in. Your village survives, smaller but still standing. From 200 original residents, maybe only 90 remain. Fields get consolidated, focusing on the best farmland. Empty houses sit abandoned. Wood and straw slowly get scavenged for other uses, but surprisingly, life starts normalizing despite the disaster. Kids are back playing in the village square. The rhythm of farming, planting, tending, and harvesting keeps going, adjusted for fewer workers. Weddings happen, babies are born, trade carries on. One crisp autumn day, a surprise guest shows up, a builder who left years ago to find work in the city. He built a good life in Florence. He tells anyone who'll listen, working on the grand cathedral there. But when the plague hit, it tore through that city worse than any countryside. I saw half of Florence die, he says, eyes haunted by memories. The rich fled to rural estates, but the poor had nowhere to run. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried. I survived, only God knows how. After the worst passed, cathedral work stopped. Too many dead. Priorities shifted to essential rebuilding. The mason, with no steady work, decided to return home. His story wasn't unique. Across Europe, the plague temporarily reversed centuries of urban growth. Crowded cities were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Survivors fled to the countryside, seeking safety in open spaces and smaller communities. This back-to-the-country migration brought unexpected benefits to rural villages like yours. People came back with new skills, fresh ideas, and perspectives gained from city life. They brought stories of different lifestyles, technological innovations, and political systems unlike the feudal rural setup. For example, Mason described Florence not ruled by hereditary nobles, but by elected officials from the merchant class. The feudal setup of the countryside, for example, Mason describes Florence as not ruled by hereditary nobles, but by elected officials from the merchant class. He talks about mechanical clocks slicing the day into precise hours, about water systems bringing clean water into the city, about banks enabling transactions on a massive scale. These ideas found a foothold in communities, starting to question traditional authority and customs. The plague cracked medieval worldviews wide open, and through those cracks, new possibilities emerged. Life goes on for you and your family in this changed world. Your brother, plague scars and all, has picked up masonry skills to build a steadier future. Your brother, now a trained mason, is set for a better life thanks to his handy skills. Your dad's carpentry keeps the family comfortably afloat. His work now pays more than anyone could have imagined before the plague hit. Your mom no longer does laundry. She's all about that herb garden now, growing medicines in high demand ever since the plague thinned out the old healers. You keep helping the priest with parish records. Your reading, writing, and quick thinking make you a rare gem in this community. Back in the old world, being a peasant would have boxed you in, no matter how sharp you were. But post-plague, with social lines blurring and talent needed everywhere, the doors swing wide open for you. One evening, your family gathers around the fire, sharing a meal richer than anything you dreamed of pre-plague. Your dad voices what many are thinking. It's awful to say this, he starts hesitantly. But for survivors like us, life's actually better now. Your mom nods slowly. More food, higher wages, more freedom. She agrees. Built on a mountain of graves. That's the grim paradox buried deep in the post-plague world. For the lucky survivors, whether it's your brother's genetic luck, dumb chance, or just dodging infection, the new world offers perks the old one never dreamed of. Population crashes bring chances for social progress, economic boosts, and personal freedom, all impossible in the crowded, rigid pre-plague society. But these perks come at an unimaginable cost. Millions dead, families shattered, communities wiped out, knowledge and culture lost with those who held it. No survivor enjoys their better circumstances without that shadow hanging over them. As you drift to sleep that night, you wonder about the future. The plague's calmed down for now, but no one believes it's gone for good. It'll be back, bringing new waves of death. Still, humanity will survive, adapt to each outbreak, invent new defenses, and slowly build the knowledge that centuries later will finally beat this invisible enemy. What you can't know, you're standing at a historic turning point. The world rising from the ashes of the Black Death will be completely different. The seeds of the Renaissance are being sown in these rebuilding years. The rigid feudal system is slowly crumbling. The iron grip of old secular and religious powers is shaking, and on a biological level, the plague is reshaping humanity itself, selecting genetic traits that affect health and disease resistance for generations to come. Your brother's survival isn't just personal luck. It's a chapter in humanity's endless dance with tiny creatures that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as the new dawn breaks over your changed world, you'll keep rebuilding, adapting, hunting for the path ahead. That's what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry the weight of memory while facing forward, and in doing so, They reshape the world in ways that echo for centuries, different from before. The seeds of the Renaissance were being planted during these recovery years. The rigid feudal regime was slowly starting to crumble. The unquestionable power of traditional authority, secular and religious, was shaken, and on a biological level, the plague reshaped humanity itself, selecting genetic traits that affected health and disease resistance for future generations. Your brother's survival wasn't just dumb luck, it was a chapter in evolution's endless dance with tiny creatures that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as dawn breaks over your changed world, you'll get back to rebuilding, adapting, and searching for the next move. That's what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry the heavy weight of memory while staring into the future, and in doing so, they reshape the world it's in ways that echo through centuries to come. The survival story we've tracked through the Black Death of the 14th century isn't the only tale of bravery and genetic luck in humanity's long dance with the plague. As the gentle darkness of sleep wraps around you, let's travel through time to another village, another outbreak, and another remarkable story of sacrifice and survival. 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death swept through Europe. Now it's the summer of 1665, and we're in Ayam, a tiny village nestled among the fields, picture-perfect hills of Derbyshire, England. By the way, is pronounced like It's a peaceful little community of around 800 folks, mostly farmers and lead miners working the rich mineral veins beneath the limestone landscape. Life here follows the usual rural English rhythm. Villagers wake up with the sun, tend their fields and livestock, work in small local industries, attend services at St. Lawrence Parish Church, and gather at the local pub to swap news and friendship. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows each other. Families have lived side by side for generations, and neighborly bonds are forged through shared joys and hardships. What the people of don't know is that they're about to face the biggest challenge imaginable, a challenge that will etch their village's name into history and mark their collective sacrifice in legend. The plague has returned to England. In London, the disease still called the Black Death by locals, though we now know it as the plague, is ravaging the crowded streets of the capital. When the outbreak ends, it will have killed about 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's population. This outbreak will be known as the Great Plague of London, the last big plague in England. Meanwhile, the people of feel safe in their isolation. They tell themselves the plague is a city problem, unlikely to reach their remote community on Derbyshire Hill, far away from major trade routes and urban centers. But fate has other plans. In late August 1665, a package arrives in addressed to Alexander Hadfield, a local man. Inside is a bundle of cloth from London, probably the latest fashion designs, or fabrics unavailable locally. Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers, who was lodging with the family, opens the package. The cloth is damp from the long journey, so Vickers hangs it by the fireplace to dry, unknowingly unleashing the deadly cargo hidden in the folds the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Within days, George Vickers falls ill with a raging fever. Painful, swollen buboes appear on his neck and armpits. The whole village watches in horror as this once healthy young man rapidly deteriorates. By September 7th, 1665, Vickers is dead. He's the first plague victim in AIM. Panic spreads through the community as more fall sick. By late September, 4 more residents have died, all from households near Vickers' home. The plague is spreading. As autumn arrives, things get worse. More villages fall ill, and death rates soar. Some families lose multiple members within days of each other. The gravediggers can't keep up with this mounting death toll. The natural reaction: run for your life. In London, anyone who could, including King Charles II and the court, fled the plague-ridden city to seek safe refuge in the countryside. The wealthy residents of Aam started preparing to leave, planning to hide out in uninfected areas until the danger passed. Right at this crucial moment, 2 men made an extraordinary proposal, a plan that would save countless lives outside Aam, but doom many inside the village to almost certain death. William Messon, Aam's newly appointed minister, and his predecessor Thomas Stanley put aside their religious differences. Messon represented the established Church of England, while Stanley, a Puritan traditionalist, presented a unified plan for the village. They proposed that Aam voluntarily quarantine itself. No one leaves, no one enters. The plague would be contained within their borders, stopping it from spreading to surrounding communities, which would face serious danger. Otherwise, it was a staggering demand. Essentially, the villagers were being asked to sacrifice themselves, accepting that more would die among them to protect strangers beyond. The amazing thing, they agreed. The village boundary became a sanitary barrier, a line between life and death that no Aam resident dared cross. Moving on, food and essentials were left by outsiders at designated boundary markers, especially by the Earl of Devonshire. From nearby Chatsworth House, he promised to supply the isolated villagers the money to pay for these necessities was placed in vinegar vats carved into stone, since vinegar was believed to disinfect coins. What followed was one of the most tragic and heroic chapters in humanity's long fight against infectious disease. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, and winter to spring. Through it all, the plague kept wreaking havoc inside AAM. Whole families wiped out, orphans so desperate they took their own lives within days. Empty houses everywhere. The unlucky souls inside were hastily buried in gardens and fields because the cemeteries filled up fast. Amid this nightmare, personal stories emerged that shine a light on the extraordinary courage, suffering, and survival of humans. Elizabeth Hancock, wife of a farmer on the edge of the village at Riley Farm, faced a nearly unimaginable loss. In just 8 days in August 1666, the plague took her husband and 6 children. No help came. Terrified neighbors wouldn't come near her infected family. Elizabeth hauled each body alone to a nearby field and buried them herself. What's remarkable isn't just her unbelievable strength in the face of such heartbreaking loss, but the fact that despite handling her family's plague-ridden corpses, she never caught the disease herself. Like other survivors we met earlier, Elizabeth might have carried the CCSF5 Delta 32 gene mutation, which protects against the plague bacteria. The Riley family, as they're known, still stand as a testament to one woman's pain and endurance today. Another extraordinary tale is that of Marshall Howe, the unofficial gravedigger of AAM. As the death toll rose, Howe took on a grim job, but not for noble reasons. He used the chaos to loot the homes of the dead before burying the bodies. Despite his shady behavior, Howe's story has a medical mystery. He handled dozens, maybe hundreds, of infected corpses. He entered plague-ridden houses that others avoided at all costs. By all logic, he should have been one of the first to die. Yet Marshall Howe survived the entire outbreak, symptom-free. Modern science offers a neat explanation. A protective gene mutation stopped the plague bacteria from invading his cells. Howe chalked it up to luck or divine protection. But really, it was a tiny DNA tweak giving him an edge in humanity's evolutionary battle against microscopic enemies. Then there's the heartbreaking story of Emmett Seidel and Roland Tora, a young couple torn apart by the village quarantine. Emmett lived inside AAM, while Roland was from a neighboring village outside the quarantine zone. When the lockdown hit, they suddenly found themselves separated indefinitely, not wanting to lose contact completely. They arranged to meet safely apart. Across Cucklet Dell, a natural mountain gap marking part of the village boundary. There, keeping their distance to avoid infection, they could at least see each other and exchange words of comfort. These brief, distant meetings got them through the first months of quarantine. But as spring turned to summer in 1666 and the plague peaked in AAM, Emmett stopped showing up at their meeting spot. Roland kept coming day after day, calling her name with no reply. Only after quarantine ended did Roland learn the truth. Emmett died in April, one of the many young victims of the plague. Their love was cut short by illness, but marked by loyal devotion. It remains one of AAM's most enduring legends. Perhaps the oddest story is infection. At least they could see each other and exchange some comforting words, share a little. These brief, distant meetings helped them endure the early months of quarantine. But as spring turned to summer in 1666 and the plague peaked in Emmett stopped coming to their meeting spot. Roland kept showing up day after day, calling her name with no reply. Only after quarantine ended did Roland learn the truth. Emmett died in April, one of many young plague victims. Their love story was cut short by sickness, but marked by loyal devotion. It remains one of Am's longest-lasting legends. Perhaps the strangest tale is that of Margaret Blackwell, who fell seriously ill with plague symptoms and was abandoned to die by her brother Francis. A feverish haze, Margaret stumbled into the kitchen, horribly thirsty, and mistook a tin of smoked lard for milk. She took a big gulp of that greasy stuff, to everyone's amazement. Margaret recovered for centuries. Villagers told the story of how smoked lard cured the plague. The truth is probably more complicated. Margaret might have carried some plague-resistant gene we've talked about and would have survived no matter what weird drink she chose. But the legend stuck around, a reminder of how desperate people were to grab at any cure that could save them from the deadly grip of the plague. Meanwhile, the village's religious leaders did their best to comfort everyone however they could. William Merson, who pushed for quarantine alongside Thomas Stanley, paid a heavy price for his brave stance. His wife, Catherine, caught the plague while caring for the sick villagers and died in his arms in August 1666, right at the peak of the outbreak. Merson later described himself as a dying man, even though he physically survived. In a letter to his kids sent away before quarantine, he wrote, "This place is a sad mess. I beg you to leave. I'm not in a state to find comfort in you. I'm too weak to write more." Yet, despite the grief, he kept serving his suffering flock until the very end. Church services moved outdoors to Cooklet Dell, where fresh air was supposed to cut down infection risk. Villagers stood far apart while praying, an early version of what we now call social distancing, even in their darkest hours, when death lurked in every shadow. This community held on to their spiritual life, finding solace in familiar rituals as the world literally fell apart around them. Not everyone was a saint. Of course, there were looters, neighbors refusing to help each other, and panic drowning out compassion. One villager, Mary Cooper, tried to break quarantine, fleeing to safety in Sheffield before getting caught and dragged back. But these slip-ups were just the exceptions. The real story of AAM is one of extraordinary collective sacrifice for the greater good. When the plague finally ended in November 1666, it had ravaged AAM for 14 months. Of the roughly 800 people in the village when it started, only about 340 survived. Entire families wiped out. The village's social fabric was shredded, leaving gaps that took generations to mend, but their sacrifice paid off. The plague stayed contained within nearby communities almost certainly doomed. If the villagers had fled, were spared the devastation. Thousands of lives saved thanks to a few hundred people choosing death over spreading disease. In the quiet aftermath, as survivors began the long haul of rebuilding their shattered community, they couldn't have known the legacy they were creating. They couldn't imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story would still be told as a shining example of courage and extraordinary community sacrifice. They had no clue that the plague that wiped out their village was the last major outbreak in England. Something about the Yersinia pestis strain that flared up in the 1660s made this plague less likely to stick around in the years after. Or maybe it was improving sanitation and housing that gradually cut down on plague-spreading rats. They couldn't know that future scientists would take a keen interest in their descendants. spotting unusually high rates of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation among people with family lines tracing back to AAM survivors. Strong evidence of how infectious diseases shape human evolution through natural selection, and they definitely couldn't know their example would hit home again in the early 21st century, when a global pandemic once again forced communities worldwide to make tough calls about isolation, quarantine, and collective sacrifice for the greater good. All they knew was they created. They couldn't imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story would still be told as an example of the courage and extraordinary sacrifice of the community. They had no clue that the plague ravaging their village was actually England's last big plague outbreak. Something about the Yersinia pestis bacteria strain that popped up in the 1660s made this plague pretty much a one-time nightmare, or maybe it was just better hygiene and housing, slowly cutting down the rat population, spreading the disease. They couldn't know that future scientists would be deeply fascinated by their descendants, discovering an unusually high rate of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation among people with family ties to plague survivors from AM. Strong evidence of how infectious diseases shaped human evolution through natural selection, and they definitely couldn't guess that their story would hit a nerve in the early 21st century, when a global pandemic once again forced communities worldwide to make tough calls about isolation, quarantine, and collective sacrifice for the greater good. All they knew was that they survived an almost incomprehensible ordeal. They watched dozens of neighbors, friends, and family members die. They held on to their self-imposed isolation through scorching summers and freezing winters, through fear, grief, and unimaginable loss. And now, as their self-imposed isolation through scorching summers and freezing winters, through fear, grief, and unimaginable loss, and now, as the plague finally hits their village, they have to figure out how to keep living. Survivors in AM face immediate, real-world problems. Fields are abandoned and uncared for. Businesses have collapsed. Houses are falling apart. With so many dead, traditional family structures are shattered. Orphaned kids need shelter, a home. Widows have to decide if they should remarry. Property ownership gets messy when whole families are wiped out. But human resilience, yeah, that stubborn thing showed up again. New families sprouted from the rubble of those wiped out by the plague. Distant relatives came back to claim abandoned land and breathe life into the drying up village. Skilled folks got snapped up and paid better than before. The plague acted like a horrific but brutally effective natural selection. Survivors, whether by genetic luck, pure chance, or some wild combo, became the foundation for the village's comeback. Their descendants carried the plague-resistant genes, even if no one would really get what that meant for centuries. For some survivors, the scars didn't fade. Elizabeth Hancock, who personally buried her whole family, eventually remarried and had kids. But the villagers say she was never quite the same. Sometimes her eyes seemed miles away, like she'd seen ghosts from that hellish week when death took everyone she loved. Marshall Howe, The shady gravedigger, who somehow survived everything, felt a bit like an outcast. Even though he seemed immune to the plague, folks still remember him looting graves. Sure, his services were needed in a crisis, but peace brought judgment on his sketchy behavior. William Merson, heartbroken over losing his beloved wife, left Aam in 1669 for another job. He remarried and lived to 71, but his letters show he never forgot the horror of those plague months or Catherine's sacrifice. Meanwhile, the village population slowly bounced back. Though some folks vanished forever from the record, quarantine became part of local law, a story passed down with pride and sorrow by the 19th century. Victorian England's growing obsession with odd historic events led to Aam's story being rediscovered and popularized. The Plague Village, true to its name, started drawing curious tourists eager to glimpse its tragic past. The Riley graves, boundary stones, and other quarantine relics turned into unofficial monuments by the 21st century. Aam was a regular stop on heritage tours through Derbyshire. The village museum told the plague and quarantine story. The parish church displayed artifacts and memorabilia. Since 1866, an annual Sunday prayer for disease prevention has marked the community's sacrifice. But Aam isn't just some historical oddity. It's still home to a living community, descendants of those plague survivors still calling it home. Some folks even share surnames with the 665 or 66 survivors. Genetic tests have found that the Hancock, Siddle, and Blackwell families still carry the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, which might have saved their ancestors from the plague. Aam's story reminds us history isn't just dusty dates and boring events. It's the real-life drama of people facing extraordinary circumstances. Choices, sacrifices, and survival shape the world we live in today. So as you drift deeper into that sweet sleep, picture Aam today peaceful, postcard perfect, with stone cottages and gardens that barely hint at the tragedy that unfolded there. Genetic testing found that the Hancock, Siddle, and Blackwell families still carry the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, which might have saved their ancestors from the plague. The story of Aam reminds us that history isn't just a list of dates and events to memorize. It's the real experiences of real people facing extraordinary circumstances, people whose choices, sacrifices, and sheer survival shaped the world we live in today. As the soothing darkness of sleep wraps around you deeper, picture the village of Aam today, peaceful, picture perfect, with stone houses and flower gardens that barely hint at the tragedy that once unfolded there. Yet, on the well-preserved boundary stones and the carefully tended Riley graves on the hillside, the past still lingers. The villagers chose self-isolation, knowing many would die, never imagining how long or how deeply their story would resonate with future generations. They acted out of direct concern for their neighbors and community, not for history's sake. And maybe that's exactly what makes their sacrifice hit so hard. They did it without expecting any applause or trophies, just because it was the right thing to do, in a world that usually puts personal gain above the common good. AAM reminds us that humans can be surprisingly selfless when the situation demands it. Tomorrow night, we'll dive into how the world shifted after these plague outbreaks, how society got rebuilt, how power structures moved around, and how the biological legacy of plague resistance still messes with human health even in our modern age. But for now, let the courage of those AAM villages lull you into dreams a quiet testament to sacrifice, survival, and ultimately hope for humanity. Now, let's jump back to the aftermath of the Black Death in the 14th century. While AAM's story from the 1660s shows village bravery, the massive pandemic of the 1300s flipped society upside down as we drift deeper into this sleepy history. Let's explore how surviving such a disaster reshaped the medieval world. Picture yourself again in that little village we visited before. But now it's 1352. The first waves of plague have finally settled, leaving behind a landscape changed in every way, physically and socially. Walking through the village that once held 200 people, you can probably count only about 90 souls left. Empty wooden houses stand like hollow skulls along the road. Their thatched roofs are starting to collapse if no one's fixing them. Gardens are overrun with weeds, yet amid this ruin, subtle signs of change are sprouting. These changes will eventually shake the foundations of medieval society. You can see it right there in the fields around the village. Before the plague, every scrap of arable land was farmed, even the poorest, least productive soil. Population growth over generations pushed farming into diminishing returns, as everyone struggled to grow enough food for their ever-growing families. Now, with so many dead, the land suddenly became abundant. Survivors abandoned the crappy fields entirely and focused their labor on the best plots. This simple switch boosted crop yields per person dramatically, whereas before, a farming family might barely scrape together enough food after paying taxes and tithes. Now, they often had a surplus. For those who lived through the apocalypse, food was way more plentiful than their memories could handle. After centuries teetering on famine's edge, this abundance felt almost magical, a tiny payoff for the heartbreak of losing so many family members and neighbors. Diets would soon shift, too, before the plague. Most peasants lived on grains, breads, porridge, and beer were their main nutrition, while meat was a rare luxury. Now, with fewer mouths to feed and more land available, many switched fields to pastures for raising cattle. Meat, cheese, and butter popped up more often on their humble tables. Average height, hammered by poor nutrition, started creeping back up as diets improved. But the deepest changes hit the relationship between laborers and landlords. The massive population loss, almost half of Europe's people, caused a serious labor shortage. Fields still needed plowing, crops still had to be harvested, cloth still needed weaving, houses still needed fixing, but there just weren't enough hands to do it all. 4. The peasants and artisans who survived. This new reality handed them unprecedented leverage. Take Thomas Fletcher, a plowman. In your village, before the plague, he worked the fields 6 days a week, earning a tiny plot of land to farm for himself and his family. If he complained or slacked off, dozens of hungry peasants would be ready to take his place. Now, with half the village workforce dead, the local man's manager came to Thomas with a special offer, a bigger plot. Cutting work from 6 days to 3, and freedom to earn money however he wanted on the side. The steward wasn't being generous. He was desperate. Without Thomas's skilled plowing, the fields would turn barren, and everyone, even the lord of the manor, would suffer. Similar scenes played out all over Europe. Peasants tied to the land for generations suddenly found themselves with more choices. Many landlords offered exemptions from labor duties as incentives to keep workers on their estates. Others swapped labor obligations for simple rent payments, letting peasants farm as they pleased, as long as they paid the agreed sum. For skilled workers, the changes were even more dramatic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and weavers were in hot demand. Wages doubled, tripled, even quadrupled in the years after the plague. A skilled carpenter who barely made enough to feed his family before now built a 2-room house with glass windows. Wearing fancy clothes and eating meat 3 times a week, these changes freaked out the nobles and rich merchants. They saw the old social order crumbling as the former underdogs demanded better treatment, and ordinary workers started living like mini aristocrats. Across Europe, governments tried freezing wages at pre-plague levels and forced workers back to their old working conditions. In England, the government dropped the Statute of Laborers in 1349, followed by tougher labor laws in 1351. These laws banned employers from paying higher wages than before the plague, stopped workers from leaving home to hunt for better gigs elsewhere, and tried to fix prices on food and other goods. Similar laws popped up all over Europe. France issued wage controls in 1351, just like the city-state of Florence. Spain's Kingdom of Castile tried to stop peasants from moving around with its own labor laws. But spoiler alert, most of these efforts failed. The labor shortage was just too real. Economic pressure was off the charts. Enforcement was pretty much impossible in rural areas where local officials counted on good relations with the remaining workers. But look the other way at rule breaking. Workers got creative dodging wage controls. A carpenter banned from making more than a certain daily wage could get paid in food, clothes, or housing on top of official wages. Farmhands could slow down or slack off unless they got paid above the legal limit. For the law enforcers, math was not their strong suit. Before the plague, a lord might have had 100 peasants working his land. Now, he was lucky to have 50 or fewer. Punishing a worker by jailing or fining them just made the labor shortage worse, and if the lord treated workers too harshly, they'd just up and leave. Law be damned. Knowing there was better work elsewhere, things hit a boiling point with peasant uprisings all over Europe. In 1358, the countryside around Paris exploded in the Jacquerie Revolt as peasants attacked noble castles and estates, brutally crushed, yes, but it showed the new confidence of the working class. In England, simmering tensions boiled over in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John Ball. Tens of thousands of commoners marched on London demanding an end to serfdom, the hated poll tax abolished, and more social equality. John Ball's famous sermon captured the revolutionary spirit perfectly. When Adam dug the earth and Eve stretched the horizon, who was the Lord? He asked rhetorically, questioning the whole idea of noble privilege. From the start, everyone was created equal, and our slavery comes from the oppression and injustice of the wicked. Although the English revolt, like the Jacquerie, was eventually crushed with a mix of empty promises and brutal force, it marked a profound shift in thinking. Peasants who once accepted their lowly place as God's will now openly questioned the social hierarchy. Workers who had few choices but to accept whatever terms were offered now demanded better treatment, plain and simple. Post-plague economic and social changes weren't just rural. Towns and cities also went through massive transformations. Urban centers had especially high death rates during the plague thanks to overcrowding. Florence, one of medieval Europe's biggest cities, lost up to 75% of its population. This tragic loss created opportunities for those who survived. Housing, once scarce and pricey in bustling cities, suddenly became plentiful and affordable. Apprentices found themselves promoted to master. Overcrowding became a nightmare. Florence, one of medieval Europe's biggest cities, lost up to 75% of its population. This heartbreaking loss opened doors for the survivors. Housing, once scarce and expensive in booming cities, suddenly became abundant and affordable. Apprentices got bumped up to masters way earlier than usual since guilds lost so many senior members. Women, traditionally shut out of many trades, stepped into roles left vacant by deceased male relatives. Take Margaretta's story, a widow of a weaver in a small town. Before the plague, she could help her husband in the workshop but wasn't allowed to run the business independently. Guild rules forbade women from owning weaving shops. When her husband died from the plague, Margareta inherited the tools, looms, and skills she picked up working alongside him. The struggling Weavers Guild faced a tough choice: enforce the ban on female members and lose a skilled apprentice, or adapt to the new reality. With fewer members and a higher demand for cloth, the guild grudgingly accepted Margareta as a full member, one of dozens of similar compromises made across Europe when necessity trumped tradition. Although opportunities like this for women would shrink once populations bounced back over generations after the plague, women still enjoyed economic roles way beyond what anyone imagined before the pandemic. The plague's aftermath also shook up fashion, art, and architecture. The sky-high death toll sparked a new obsession with death's inevitability and life's fragility. Creepy became cool in art. Skeletons, skulls, and dance of death scenes where bony figures lead all social classes too. Their graves were everywhere. But alongside this morbid fascination was a celebration of life and its pleasures. Survivors probably realized just how fast their existence could end, so they embraced luxury and beauty with fresh gratitude for those who could afford it. Clothes got fancier and way more colorful, the drab, practical outfits of the medieval eras gave way to rich fabrics, bold designs, and styles that shouted status. Nobles, worried that commoners might outdress them, tried to enforce sumptuary laws dictating who could wear what. These edicts, much like wage controls, mostly failed spectacularly. Technically, a wealthy artisan's wife might be banned from wearing silk, but if she had the cash, who in her town had the authority or guts to stop her? Religious attitudes shifted too. The church, which ruled intellectual and spiritual life in the Middle Ages, faced a serious power crisis. Many priests and monks fled their posts during the plague, abandoning their flocks when comfort was most needed. Others stayed and died, leaving parishes leaderless. Monasteries, with their communal lifestyles, suffered especially high death rates, wiping out centuries of knowledge and tradition. Basically, the plague sparked some awkward theological questions. If this disaster was God's punishment, as many church leaders claimed, why did the good and bad die alike? Why did devout monks perish while godless peasants survived, if prayer and repentance were the cure? Why did the plague hit monasteries hardest? No satisfying answers came from traditional theology, which began to lose its grip. Instead, two religious trends emerged. Some survivors got even more devout, seeing their survival as proof of God's favor, demanding worship and gratitude. Others grew skeptical of religious authorities, who failed to explain or soften the disaster. This spirit of questioning, combined with economic shifts, gave ordinary folks more resources and free time, laying fertile ground for intellectual growth that would eventually bloom into the Renaissance, when fewer hands had to make society's essentials. More minds could focus on art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, once the exclusive playground of clergy and nobles, gradually spread to broader social classes. Merchants and newly wealthy artisans wanted their kids to read, write, and do math skills, useful for business and climbing the social ladder. Small schools popped up in towns and even larger villages, teaching practical knowledge alongside traditional religious lessons. The demographic shock from the plague also pushed a technological innovation, with labor scarce and expensive. Techniques that saved human muscle power suddenly became a hot commodity. Water mills, originally just for grinding grain, got a serious upgrade. Now they powered bellows for blast furnaces, hammers for metalwork, weaving looms, printing presses, you name it. This tech would eventually revolutionize spreading knowledge all across Europe, kickstarted by a nasty labor shortage after the plague. Hand-copied manuscripts, which took months by skilled scribes, became insanely expensive once those scribes started demanding higher pay. The economic squeeze to find mechanical alternatives pushed the invention of the movable type printing press in the mid-15th century. The biggest shakeup, the plague totally rattled Europe's stubborn medieval traditions. Half the population wiped out in a few years. Social hierarchies crumbled and got rebuilt in new forms. And the old rulers who never got questioned, they couldn't explain or protect anyone anymore. The idea that the world had to stay the same lost all its mojo after the Black Death. People started imagining alternatives to the old social contracts, new ways to organize work, spread resources, and set up authority. Most of these ideas never got off the ground, and many changes were just temporary fixes. But the mental block against change weakened, giving room for fresh ideas in thought, tech, art, and social structures, innovations that eventually turned medieval Europe into the first modern world for the folks living through it. It wasn't just epic history unfolding, it was about daily tweaks. Thomas the Plowman wasn't pondering feudal collapse. He just wanted to negotiate better terms with his landlord so his family could eat better. Margarita, the weaver, didn't see herself as part of a gender revolution. She was just using her skills to keep food on the table after her husband died. But these personal adaptations multiplied across millions of survivors, reshaping society bit by bit, like water slowly eroding stone. Countless small choices by ordinary people in extraordinary times chipped away at, and eventually transformed the supposedly rock-solid structures of medieval life. Not all change was instant good news. The labor shortage that helped workers hurt a lot of landlords. Some estates totally failed because owners couldn't handle the new economy. Churches, monasteries, and charities that relied on steady rents and donations struggled to survive when income dropped. Crime spiked in some areas, as unsupervised young men with cash blew it all on booze and trouble. Abandoned rural properties sometimes turned into hideouts for outlaws. City officials worried about keeping order when patrols weakened. For decades after the first plague wave, smaller outbreaks kept popping up across Europe, blocking population recovery and cementing the economic and social shifts the initial pandemic had kicked off. Only by the late 15th century did Europe's population start growing steadily again, and it wasn't until the 17th century that many areas reached pre-plague numbers. This long demographic slump meant Black Death changes had time to stick. Temporary disruptions turned into the new normal as population pressures reversed some of the workers' economic gains. Other medieval social aspects were permanently altered. We've been tracking peasant family stories through the decades after the plague brought slow improvements. Your brother, miraculously surviving the sickness, finally took over a nearby farm abandoned by a family wiped out. What was impossible before the plague, one peasant owning a decent chunk of land, became doable in the now sparsely populated countryside. The economic and social shifts caused by the first pandemic were just starting. It wasn't until the late 15th century that Europe's population began to grow steadily again, and only by the 17th century did many regions reach pre-plague levels. This prolonged demographic decline meant that changes triggered by the Black Death had time to become permanent. Temporary disruptions turned into the new normal as population pressures reversed some of the common workers' economic advantages. Other medieval social aspects were permanently altered for peasant families. We've tracked their story for decades after the plague brought gradual improvements. Your brother, who miraculously survived the disease, eventually took over a nearby farm abandoned by a family wiped out. What was impossible before the plague, a peasant owning significant land, became doable in these sparsely populated rural areas. Your dad, a highly sought-after carpenter, landed a contract to help rebuild the local church, damaged by years of neglect during the plague years. The money he earned let him add a second room to your family home and swap the dirt floor for wooden boards, small little luxuries. That would have been unimaginable before the plague. Your mom taught you and your sister how to read, a skill she picked up working as a servant in a merchant's household before she got married. Before the plague hit, stuff like that was pretty much worthless for farm kids. But in the changing world of the late 14th century, being able to read suddenly opened doors that used to be slammed shut for regular folks. One autumn evening, as your family huddled by the fire after a long day's work, your dad said something the older generation would never have dreamed of. Maybe he could become a pastor, he told you, nodding thoughtfully. The monastery was looking for someone who could read and write to help keep records. The pay would be good, and the job wouldn't wreck his body. Your brother laughed, not in a mean way. A clergyman in my family, what would Granddad say? The idea of a farm kid doing that kind of work really seemed ridiculous to the older generations, who saw social boundaries as rigid and unbreakable as the stars. But as you drifted off to sleep that night, that possibility didn't feel like some far-off dream. It felt real. This might just be the most important legacy of the Black Death, not just the immediate changes in wages, working conditions, and social structure, but the expansion of what ordinary people could even imagine for themselves and their kids. As dawn approaches and our little history journey nears its end, we'll leave you at this moment full of possibility. Your world was shattered by unimaginable loss, then slowly rebuilt into something different than before. The medieval certainties that once ruled life were questioned, challenged, and sometimes overturned. What you can't know as a survivor of these changes is that you're standing at a pivotal moment in Western history. The adaptations, innovations, and rethinking caused by the plague would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and finally the birth of the modern world. But that's a story for our last night together, when we explore how the long shadow of the Black Death stretched across centuries, shaping art, science, medicine, and society in ways that still influence our world today. As our journey through the plague survivor's world ends, Open your eyes to how the Black Death's impact kept spreading over time, molding the world in subtle and profound ways. The echoes of this medieval disaster still resonate in our bodies, societies, and understanding of disease to this day. Let's start with still echo in our bodies, society, and understanding of disease today. Let's start with probably the most remarkable legacy, the biological inheritance carried by descendants of plague survivors. Remember the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation we talked about? This genetic quirk protected some medieval Europeans from the plague. This tiny DNA variant didn't vanish when the plague retreated. It passed down through generations, enriching the European gene pool because carriers were more likely to survive and reproduce. Going back 600 years to the late 20th century, and bam, a new pandemic appears. HIV/AIDS wiped out millions worldwide. Medical researchers scrambled to understand this new beast and stumbled upon something amazing. Some people naturally resist HIV despite repeated exposure. Digging deeper revealed why many carry that CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the same genetic variant that helped their ancestors survive the Black Death. The connection became clear when scientists figured out how both diseases work. Both the plague bacteria and HIV use the CCR5 protein as a gateway into human cells. The Delta 32 mutation changes this protein, slamming the door on these pesky invaders. A genetic tweak favored by a 14th century killer plague suddenly offers defense against a totally different 20th century threat. This discovery led to new HIV drugs that block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking the mutation's natural protective trick. So basically, medieval plague survivors helped save modern lives. Their genetic legacy gave us crucial clues to fight a disease they never even dreamed of. But the plague's biological impact wasn't just about this one mutation. The Black Death acted as a brutal natural selection force, likely shaping other parts of the European immune system. Today's population looks very different from those survivors, whose bodies, thanks to various genetic reasons, handled the Yersinia pestis bacteria's attack better. Some scientists even speculate that certain autoimmune diseases, where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, are an unintended side effect of this selection. Our ancestors survived the plague because their immune response was especially strong, but that supercharged defense might make their descendants more prone to illnesses like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system goes into overdrive. These biological links between past and present remind us that pandemics don't just kill people and vanish from history. They reshape the genetic makeup of survivors, causing changes that last for centuries or even millennia after the immediate crisis fades. The social and economic shifts from the Black Death lasted just as long, while the immediate effects, labor shortages, wage hikes, and social mobility faded as Europe's population bounced back. Some fundamental changes stuck around. Take serfdom, that medieval system tying peasants to the land for generations before the plague hit in Western Europe. This system never fully recovered after the Black Death's disruption, despite landlords' attempts to reimpose old restrictions. Demographics worked against them. Land stayed relatively abundant, while labor was scarce for centuries, giving workers leverage that slowly eroded feudal obligations. By the late to Middle Ages, serfdom had mostly vanished from England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by various leasing arrangements, allowing more personal freedom. Peasants still worked the land, but increasingly paid rent instead of serving as labor-bound serfs under traditional submission. Eastern Europe took a different route. There, nobles managed to rebuild and even fully recovered after the disruption caused by the Black Death, even though landlords tried to reimpose old restrictions. The demographics just weren't on their side. Land was still relatively plentiful and labor scarce for centuries, giving workers leverage that slowly chipped away at feudal duties. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had mostly vanished in England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by various forms of leases that allowed more personal freedom. Peasants still worked the land, but increasingly as paying tenants, rather than servants bound by labor obligations and traditional submission. Eastern Europe took a different route. There, the nobility managed to rebuild and even strengthen serfdom after the plague, creating what historians call the Second Serfdom, which lasted until the 19th century. The contrast between Western and Eastern European social systems, one moving toward more freedom for common people, the other tightening control, deeply shaped the later development of these regions. The Black Death also sped up some serious changes in religious life. The Catholic Church, which basically ran the intellectual and spiritual show in the Middle Ages, suddenly faced serious challenges to its power after the plague. People started asking, why didn't prayers work? Why couldn't religious parades stop the disease? And why did devout monks kick the bucket right alongside sinners? These questions cracked the once unshakable faith building. Those cracks only grew wider in the centuries that followed. The 16th century Protestant Reformation, challenging Catholic authority and emphasizing personal Bible interpretation, found fertile ground in a community already skeptical of religious orthodoxy. While the Reformation had many causes, historians see plague-era disillusionment as a big motivator for millions wanting to break centuries-old traditions. Even art and literature got a makeover thanks to the Black Death. Medieval art was mostly religious Bible stories, saints, divine figures, but post-plague, new themes appeared: the Dance of Death, featuring skeletons leading folks from all walks of life to their graves. Paintings reminded people of death, focusing more on human experience than just holy matters. This human-centered shift, called humanism, bloomed in the Renaissance alongside rediscovered classical knowledge from Greece and Rome. This new people-first view basically rewired how Europeans saw themselves and their world. The plague's impact even crept into language. Our modern English vocabulary still echoes the Black Death. We say quarantine, from the Italian quarantina giorni, or 40 days the time ships had to hang out in Venice's harbor during plague outbreaks. We call someone on the lam, originally a marked boundary around a prison where guards could shoot escapees, kind of like quarantine zones around plague areas. Even innocent childhood rhymes carry dark memories. Ring around the rosy, with its pocket full of posies. Ash, ash, we all fall down, is often thought to reference plague symptoms, the rash, the remedies tried, the flowers used to ward off disease, and ashes from cremations. Scholars debate this, but it shows how plague imagery dug deep into cultural memory. The Black Death also changed humanity's relationship with disease itself. Before plague times, sickness was mostly seen as divine punishment or body imbalance, no real idea about germs like we have now. The clear way plague spread along trade routes, person to person, through close contact, forced people to accept contagiousness for at least some diseases. Communities responded practically, even without germ theory, which only popped up in the 19th century. By combining effective public health measures, ships got quarantined, infected households isolated, plague victims burned, and their belongings torched. Cities appointed health boards with special powers during outbreaks, setting disease control rules that shaped public health for centuries. These practical moves, born from bitter experience rather than science, saved countless lives in later plague waves. By the time Europe's last big plague hit Marseille in 1720, authorities, cultural memory, and all that jazz, the Black Death also flipped humanity's relationship with disease. Before the plague, people mostly thought sickness was divine punishment or just a nasty imbalance of bodily fluids, with barely a clue about germs or infections like we understand today. The clear pattern of plague spreading along trade routes, jumping from person to person through close contact, made it impossible to ignore that at least some diseases were highly contagious. Communities responded with practical measures, even though they had no germ theory, because that genius idea only showed up in the 19th century. But they still managed to combine effective public health moves. Ships were quarantined, infected households isolated, plague victims burned, and their stuff usually torched too. Cities set up special public health councils with extra powers during outbreaks, laying down the rules for managing epidemics that shaped public health policies for centuries. These pragmatic approaches came from bitter experience, not science, but they saved countless lives in later plague outbreaks. By the time Europe's last big plague hit Marseille in 1720, authorities had learned how to enforce lockdowns, hygiene, strict quarantines, and careful monitoring to mostly contain the outbreak within that city and its surroundings. Of course, these measures came way too late for the millions who died in the initial pandemic, but the lessons learned from the Black Death helped reduce later plague waves and offer better responses to other epidemics. When cholera struck Europe in the following centuries, the survivors of the plagues we've been following over these past nights, huge historical patterns meant little compared to their direct, lived experience. Thomas, the plowman, negotiating better work conditions after 19th century. Public health officials borrowed plague control tricks to stop it from spreading clunky at first, but getting better as science caught up. The plague's legacy still haunts how we manage pandemics today. Many of the moves used during recent COVID-19 outbreaks, quarantines, travel bans, contact tracing, isolating the sick are all old-school plague hacks. Even the tug-of-war between economic pain and public health measures echoes medieval debates on whether to shut down cities and markets during plague outbreaks. Maybe the biggest takeaway: the Black Death rewired how humans think about catastrophe. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where disaster was basically just lurking around the corner. War, famine, and small outbreaks stole lives regularly, but nothing came close to the scale and speed of the plague. Facing what felt like apocalypse-level death forced a collective mental reset. Survivors learned they could endure unimaginable losses and still keep going. Individuals discovered resilience they didn't even know they had. Societies developed institutional memory and adaptive behaviors for future crises. Bouncing back from disaster became one of humanity's most valuable skills. Throughout history, communities have stared down disasters that seemed impossible to survive, yet somehow life went on. People mourned the dead, rebuilt their homes, tweaked their customs, and moved forward carrying memories of what was lost while creating something new from the wreckage. This pattern repeats itself after every big disaster, from volcanic eruptions burying Pompeii to the devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755, from the 1918 flu pandemic to more recent natural disasters and disease outbreaks. The Black Death is probably the ultimate extreme example of this kind of disaster, proving humanity's insane ability to endure, adapt, and ultimately keep on living. This isn't to downplay the suffering those events caused. Plague brought pain beyond imagination, tore families and communities apart, and stole millions of unique lives, each one a universe of experience and potential. No social change or biological adaptation can justify losses like that. Still, understanding how humans weathered this storm helps us grasp our own potential to face today's and tomorrow's challenges. Climate change, new diseases, tech disruptions. Our world is no stranger to threats. The history of the Black Death reminds us that generations before us faced their own seemingly unbeatable crises and found ways to carry on. For those survivors we've been following these past nights, these grand historical patterns probably meant zilch compared to their raw, lived experience. Thomas, the plowman, was busy negotiating better working conditions after the labor shortage, not pondering the long-term collapse of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock burying her family on the hill above Ayam couldn't have imagined that her genetic legacy might shield descendants from 20th century diseases. Still, on the whole, the experiences and adaptations of individuals created profound changes, transforming medieval society into something new. History often unfolds this way, not just through grand decisions by great leaders or breakthrough moments, but through the labor shortage, wasn't thinking about the long-term fall of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock, burying her family on the hill above Aham, couldn't imagine her genetic legacy might shield descendants from 20th century diseases. Yet, overall, individual experiences and adaptations built profound changes, transforming medieval society into something new. History often works this way, not just through grand leaders' decisions or dramatic turning points, but through the cumulative impact of millions of ordinary people reacting to extraordinary times as best they could. As we wrap up our journey into the world of plague survivors, what can we learn from their experience? Maybe the biggest lesson is appreciating human resilience. The Black Death caused almost unimaginable losses. Half the population wiped out in many regions, entire families and villages erased. Their takeaway, probably the biggest one, respect human resilience. The Black Death caused losses so insane they're almost impossible to wrap your head around. Half the population gone in many places, entire families and villages wiped off the map. Centuries of knowledge and culture vanished with the people carrying them, yet somehow the survivors rallied the will to rebuild, so crafting new families and communities from the leftover rubble. We can also think about how even the worst disasters sometimes create new chances. The rigid social structure of medieval Europe, as predictable as the seasons, shattered when demographics suddenly shifted. Folks stuck in fixed social roles found new opportunities afterward. We never want disaster as the driver of change, but history shows transformation often sneaks in through crisis. The plague story also reminds us of our biological connections to each other and the tiny creatures sharing this planet. The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis shaped genetics, social structures, economies, and human culture in ways that still ripple into our world today. Other bacteria played similar influential roles throughout history. We live in a constant dance with the invisible biological world that can both sustain and threaten us. Finally, maybe the plague tale offers a perspective on mortality and our own fragility. Medieval folks lived with death as a constant companion in ways most modern Westerners don't. The plague sharpened death's presence, inspiring art, literature, and philosophy reflecting on life's fleeting, delicate nature. This awareness wasn't necessarily morbid or depressing. In fact, many plague survivors embraced life anew, fully aware how suddenly and unexpectedly it could end. There's wisdom here, not a death-obsessed fear, but a clear-eyed appreciation for life's value precisely because it's limited and uncertain. As this story winds down and you're about to drift off, picture that medieval village we first visited. A generation after the plague passed, the population's bouncing back, kids playing in the streets, young families moving in too, houses abandoned for years. The survivors, now older, carry memories of what happened, both the horrors they witnessed and the changes they helped bring about afterward. They had no clue how their experience would echo through centuries shaping everything from genetics to social order. From art to public health approaches, they just lived the best they could under circumstances they'd never choose, showing human adaptability and grit that kept our species pushing through countless challenges. And maybe that's the coziest thought to take into sleep. Like plague survivors, we have resilience and adaptability we might not realize until life demands it. Life, fragile as it is, tends to persist, rebuild, finding new paths when old ones get blocked. The Black Death survivors could never have imagined our world with modern medical tech, instant global communication, and scientific understanding of the very bacteria that tortured them. We can't fully picture the world our descendants will inherit generations from now, but like our medieval ancestors, we move forward, carrying wounds from past disasters and the lessons learned from surviving them, contributing in small or big ways to humanity's ongoing story. Sleep tight, knowing you're part of a long human chain, connected to those who came before and those who'll come after. Every generation faces its own battles. Every species finds its own way to survive, adapt, and eventually keep this remarkable human journey rolling through time.